Robert Hansen, also known as the Buddha Baker, was one of the most despicable villains the FBI ever tangled with. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, Robert turned the wild woods of Alaska into his own personal playground. He abducted adult entertainers and exotic dancers, and would then let them loose in the remote wilderness, after which he'd proceed to hunt them like animals. He was a social outcast who grew up paranoid that everyone was out to get him. He burned down a school bus garage in 1960, spent a couple of years in jail, and then fled the contiguous United States in 1967. He subsequently joined a small community in Alaska and opened up a bakery. He was arrested multiple times for assaulting and abducting women, but he always made bail and was released. Then in 1973 he started kidnapping people and hunted them down in the woods. In 1983, over a decade after he'd moved to Alaska, a woman named Cindy Paulson escaped his wicked game. He'd kidnapped the 18-year-old girl and her at his house. Then he prepared to load her into his plane and take her out to his cabin where he would hunt her. However, as he was preparing the plane, Cindy escaped and ran off. After she told her story to the police, the FBI got involved. FBI agent John Douglas put together a psychological profile of the killer, which eventually led them to Robert Hansen, who confessed to 17 women over 12 years. As a punishment for his horrific actions, he was given 461 years in prison. Number 9. The Alcatraz escapees. The U.S. Marshals Service recently released updated renderings of 3 fugitives who escaped Alcatraz on June 11, 1962. These new renderings show what the escapees would look like if they were still alive today, even though they'd be in their 90s by now. These criminals are Frank Morris, John Anglin, and John's brother, Clarence Anglin. All 3 of them created fake heads to make it look like they were still sleeping and tunneled through the solid concrete walls of their cells. They then escaped Alcatraz Island and paddled away into the night on a raft made from prison raincoats. They were the only men to ever successfully escape Alcatraz without getting caught. These days, their escape is one of the FBI's biggest failures. A raft was allegedly discovered after the escape, and 3 men were spotted stealing a car that same night. The Anglin brothers were supposedly photographed at a bar in Brazil in 1975, but that was the closest anyone ever came to seeing the 3 fugitives alive. Number 8. John Dillinger. John Dillinger was one of the first criminals ever hunted by the FBI. His infamy began on May 10, 1933, after he'd just finished serving nearly 9 years in prison and immediately went to rob a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. John was arrested by Dayton police on September 22nd and was subsequently booked into the county jail in Lima, where he'd wait for his trial. Days later, 8 of John's pals broke out of the Indiana State Prison and 2 guards in the process. From there, the crew went on an insane spree of terror that lasted until July of 1934. 10 men robbed multiple banks and staged a total of 3 jailbreaks. The crew only got busted on January 23, 1934, because a fire started at the hotel they were staying at. Firemen recognized the criminals from their photographs, and John Dillinger was arrested, and so too were 3 other men in his gang. John was taken to the county jail in Crown Point, Indiana, but apparently no cell could hold him, and he once again broke free and ran away. The FBI launched a manhunt as John continued robbing banks throughout the country. It wasn't until July 22, 1934 that they finally cornered him. John was sold out by a madam of a brothel named Anna Campanas. Anna was in the middle of being deported back to Romania and was willing to trade information in order to stay in the US. They tried to take him peacefully, but John pulled out a pistol and started shooting. 3 FBI agents shot him though, and he fell to the pavement. Number 7. The Unabomber. On May 25, 1978, a package that was delivered to the Northwestern University of Evanston, Illinois, exploded. Over the next 17 years, 15 more bombings would occur in the United States of America. 3 people were and many others were injured as the FBI tried desperately to track down a man known only as the Unabomber. He ripped the skin off batteries so they couldn't be traced, and he even made his own glue by melting down deer hooves. He also never left any trace of DNA or fingerprints. The Unabomber started sending letters to the media and to his victims in the early 1990s. Then in 1995, he sent his manifesto to the biggest papers in the country. His view was that society should be erased, technology should stop, and people should go back to living in tribes made up of hunters and gatherers. Fitzgerald used a manifesto to help build a profile that ultimately led them to Ted Kaczynski in 1996. Fitzgerald was able to get into Kaczynski's head and realized he was likely a loner, someone who lived in isolation far from civilization. They eventually tracked Ted Kaczynski to a cabin in Montana where he was living as a hermit. Kaczynski pleaded guilty to the bombings in 1998 and was sentenced to life in prison as a result. Number 6. Durkin. The first FBI agent ever killed in the line of duty was Edwin C. Shanahan, who was shot dead on October 11, 1925. Special Agent Shanahan was killed as he was trying to apprehend the automobile thief Martin James Durkin. Durkin already had an extensive criminal record. He previously shot 3 policemen in Chicago and a 4th officer in California. Edwin Shanahan received information that Durkin was expected at a garage in Chicago with a stolen automobile that he'd brought up from New Mexico. The agent and local police descended on the garage and waited for Durkin. However, after many hours passed, they decided the information was bogus. The officers left, but Shanahan remained fixed on the garage, hoping that at some point Durkin would show up. And he did. Shanahan tried to take on Durkin by himself, but was shot straight to the chest with a revolver. This resulted in a cross-country manhunt. Special agents with the FBI learned he was in the stateroom car with a mysterious woman and would be arriving at 11 in the morning. So the FBI had the train stopped just outside a small town before it could reach the city. That way the murderer had nowhere to run if he escaped. The train was surrounded, and Durkin was eventually dragged out of the stateroom. Durkin went to jail in 1926 but was released in 1954 at the age of 53. He passed away 27 years later in 1981. Number 5. James Eddie Diggs. James Eddie Diggs was allegedly a normal, happy, regular kind of guy. He worked as a mechanic at a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. He was a family man who was a respected member of his community, and his neighbors described him as a hard-working individual. And yet, at 7 a.m. on May 26, 1949, James shot his wife Ruth and murdered their 2 young sons, James Jr. and Alfonso. After the unprovoked killings, James went on the run. On May 31st, he was identified in North Carolina, where he was pulled over by law enforcement. He then shot Officer Rex Howell, critically wounding him, and then vanished without a trace. That was the last time James was ever seen, and to this day he remains on the most wanted list of the FBI. Number 4. Eduardo Ravello. Eduardo Ravello was once on the FBI's most wanted list. He's a Mexican-American gangster who used to be the head of the Barrio Ateca gang. He earned the position of gang leader by betraying his old boss. Eduardo then took over the group, and these weren't the kind of people you'd want to mess around with. They allegedly operated as hitmen for the Mexican cartels. In 2017, the FBI was seeking help in capturing Eduardo. They offered $100,000 for any information that would lead to an arrest. They were desperate for help because Eduardo was wanted in connection to murdering a pregnant U.S. consulate employee, her husband, and the husband of another consulate worker. Thankfully, the FBI announced that the gangster was captured in June of 2018 following a police raid in Mexico. Number 3. Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph was born in Merritt Island, Florida on September 19, 1966. He served briefly in the U.S. Army, then worked as a carpenter. But he later went on to become a murderer. He was responsible for the devastating bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. 2 people were killed as a result, and over 100 others were injured. On January 16, 1997, a pair of bombs went off at a clinic that performed abortions, subsequently wounding 7 people. The month after, a bomb exploded at a nightclub in Atlanta, injuring 4 people. Then on January 29, 1998, a woman's health clinic in Birmingham, Alabama was targeted. A bomb blew up, killing 1 security guard and critically injuring a nurse. Authorities launched a manhunt, but Eric was nowhere to be found. He remained on the FBI's most wanted list from between 1998 and 2003. And in the end, he wasn't even caught by the FBI. A rookie police officer ended up discovering Eric digging through a dumpster in the town of Murphy, North Carolina. All that time on the run had depleted Eric's funds, and he was starving. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 4 life terms and is currently at the Supermax Federal Prison in Florence. Number 2. Michael Tevis. Michael Tevis made a fortune in the 1970s through peep show machines. Michael boasted that 99% of the adult magazines and films sold in America moved through his warehouse. He also had his own factory in Atlanta in which he manufactured a revolutionary new machine. It was an 8mm projector that played films on a 15-second loop. Michael leased these machines to adult bookstores where they went into private booths and were fed quarters by millions of men who had no access to the internet. The invention apparently made Michael an estimated $2 billion. However, Michael had some competition from a man named Kenneth Hanna, so Michael invited Kenneth to his warehouse to talk about business opportunities. Once they were there, he pulled out a pistol and shot Kenneth 3 times in the chest. This was all because Michael had heard that Kenneth was ripping off his idea and was trying to profit off of his machines. Michael got away with the killing until 1978 when he was snitched on by a former employee. He was charged with murder, but he managed to escape from his jail cell in New Albany, Indiana later that same year. He went on the run, but was tracked down by the FBI. Number 1. Billy Bryant. In April of 1968, Billy Bryant was sentenced to 54 years in prison for bank robbery and assault. By August of that same year, he'd escaped his incarceration at the Corrections Reformatory in Lorton, Virginia, and was on the run. Billy stole a vehicle he'd been working on at the automobile shop inside the reformatory, then drove it through a chain-link gate and took off. Billy robbed a bank on January 8, 1969, but FBI agents caught up to Billy at his wife's house not far from the bank he'd just robbed. When they knocked on the door, Billy shot all 3 agents at point-blank range and then slammed the door shut. One of the agents survived the brutal attack, but Edwin R. Woodruff and Anthony Palmisano were pronounced dead upon their arrival at the hospital. Agents and police surrounded the house, but Billy was long gone. He'd scrambled out an upper window and escaped down a tree. The police then received a call from a concerned citizen that somebody was in their attic. The FBI showed up, and Billy Bryant was then dragged back to jail. He was only on the FBI's most wanted list for 2 hours before being caught.